Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to do a bit more work on the P407. We've got a couple of bits to do, but the original plan was to quickly swap out the servo saver, lock the rear diff and pop in some LEDs. But you can plan all you like, sometimes things just don't quite work out. We start then with the nice aluminium servo arm that came with a 20 kilogram servo. To fit it, first we need to pop the cover off the bottom of the radio box. Just like we did when we swapped the servo, we need to remove the 4 screws and slide it out through the rear. This time I'm going to uncouple the drive shaft from the axle too. It will make access a bit easier, plus we're going to need to remove it anyway when we lock the rear diff. There we go then, you can actually see inside this time, although it is a bit dark, so I think I'll have to boost the shadows a bit. If you're looking at it with a TN type display, it's probably just a nice purple glow in there as it is. First of all, we need to remove the servo screw and pull the servo saver off while also popping the ball off the linkage. We'll need the ball end from the servo saver to transfer to the new arm, and excuse the blurriness, it seems that when the camera zoomed in a bit it's easy to get too close for it to focus. All we need to do with the ball end is use a cross wrench on the ball as it's got a built-in nut and remove the screw from the other side. Here's the new arm then, and you can find them on eBay for a couple of quid in various colours. They clamp around the servo splines and usually do a very good job. Compared to the servo saver though, it's really quite long. The middle hole in the servo saver is a lot closer to the centre. That means if we use the aluminium arm without changing anything, we'd need to reduce the endpoints on the transmitter to something really very low, far from ideal. We could drill and tap another hole, which would get around the issue, however the arm is way too long to even fit in the radio box. And again, we could just cut the end off to make it fit, but ultimately we want to move the servo to the front of the chassis anyway, where we might need the longer arm, so it seems a shame to hack it. Instead, I've dug through my boxes of junk and found a nice chunky plastic one. The hole is still a little bit far out, but it's going to be a lot closer to what we need. And the best bit is, it just about fits in the box, but with less than a millimetre of clearance. But it's going to work. For whatever the arm was in before, I've already tapped the hole. So all we need to do is screw the screw for the ball in from the bottom. Add a little bit of thread lock just to make sure it doesn't vibrate loose. And we can thread the ball on and give it an extra little nip so it's all nice and solid. Next we need to make sure the servo is centred. Now we'd usually use a servo tester, but this model has the radio safely sealed up and it would be a bit of a faff to get at the servo connector. Instead we'll go through the menus on the transmitter and set all the steering trims to 0, and you should probably set the endpoints to 100% too. Now with the battery hooked up to the truck and everything switched on, we can fit the servo arm. We need to try and get it as close to pointing straight up as we can. They're almost always off a bit one way or the other, but you can usually get them pretty close. Next, because this radio has sub-trims, we can use them to nudge the servo just a bit so it's bang on. By using the sub-trim, the regular steering trim will still be at 0. With that all set up, we can pop the servo screw back in, making sure it's fully seated. Being a plastic arm, it's nice and tight over the splines, so the screw can be stiff to turn while it pulls the arm over the spline. When it's all snug, the screw will quite suddenly get very hard to turn. Now we just pop the ball back on the rod end, which is easier said than done, access not ideal. Next is the cover plate with the 4 screws. Do them up, and the first item of the day is done. Next then, we're going to lock the rear diff. We've already uncoupled the drive shaft, so all we need to do is loosen the 4 nuts that clamp the axle to the springs. Just a turn or so is all they need. Then we can flip the axle over, revealing the grub screw that blocks access to the hole. In theory, all we should have to do is remove the grub screw and put it to one side. Then take one of the small screw pins from the accessory bags that come with the kit. Line up all the bits through the hole and pop the pin in. It should be really straightforward, but after a fair bit of fiddling I couldn't get a nice fit for all the parts. It either felt like something was catching, or the pin wouldn't find its way into position at all. So rather than risk doing damage, I figured it would be better just to remove the axle and pop it open so we can see what's going on. To make things a bit easier, we might as well remove the wheels. You might get away with leaving them on, but getting at the screws on the ends of the axles would be a bit of a faff. Now we have a nice clear view of the axle, we can remove it. As long as we're very careful, it's possible to do it without having to restack all the bits on the leaf spring and the axle. We need to remove the 8 nuts that clamp the whole lot together. Now the U-bolts aren't perfect, so they spring outwards ever so slightly, which will stop them from falling out. Next we need to remove the flat plates. This requires the use of the sign of the horns gesture, with your little finger holding one of the pair of U-bolts and your index finger the other. We need to keep a bit of upwards pressure so the stack of bits stays roughly in place. Remove the plates and the axle should lift away. Only the 2 rods that go off to the centre of the chassis get in the way, but there's enough spring in them that you can get the axle past. Now we can pop the 2 plates back over the U-bolts, and if you're a little bit lucky and you're really gentle, everything should stay together when you take your hand away. Right then, so here we have one rear axle ready to take apart. There's 10 M2 screws to remove, there's 2 lengths, 4 longer ones at either side of the diff, and the rest of them are a bit shorter. And of course, if all else fails, you should have the build manual with all the lengths in anyway. Remove all 10 and the axle should split apart with very little fuss. There's a fair amount of grease in there, which is nice to see. Most of the shafts are greased up too, which should help stop any rust. Quite nicely done really. I was about to start fitting the pin, getting everything lined up, now we can actually see what we're doing, but I noticed something a bit odd with the input shaft. It looked like a mashed up shim with bits hanging off. On close inspection we can just about see that the larger of the bearings has in fact had a rather catastrophic failure. The bits hanging off are the remains of the clip and seal from the bearing. They've been well and truly eaten alive. The bearing must have failed on the last run, probably when trying to bounce the truck over some rubble. With the E-clip removed from the end of the shaft, and the smaller bearing slid off, we can see the damage. The outer race is still present, but most of the balls have spread themselves evenly around the inside. We'll have to carefully check around the diff to make sure there's none hiding in the grease. One of those little steel balls could really do some damage to the gears. So this is where the plans got delayed a bit. To rebuild the axle we're going to need a new bearing, and of course it's not one I have in stock, and I'm filming this on a Friday night. So there wasn't anything else to do but check the manual for the size, which says 12 by 8 by 3.5, but if you search that you won't get many results as the internal diameter usually comes first, so 8 by 12 by 3.5. I placed an order on Saturday night after not finding any to buy locally, and waited. Okay, Thursday now, and we've got some new bearings. They took a couple of days to arrive from RC Bearings, but they're always well worth the wait. The quality is always top notch. Every Tamiya kit that I've built that comes with bushings gets an RC Bearings kit, and I've never had one fail. Now I was tempted to get a full bearing kit for the P407 rather than just the replacement, but I thought I'd give HG the benefit of the doubt for now, and see if this broken one is just a one-off. I spent some time off camera with a loop and a cocktail stick searching for stray balls. I didn't find any, but it's still very important to make sure. Next we can slide on one of the new bearings, followed by the stock smaller bearing, and lastly the washer that was on there originally. Then there's the E-clip, which keeps the bearing in position. If we slot it into the axle, we can hold it down and give the diff a spin and make sure it feels like it's going to work. And it certainly looks okay. Now to do what we were trying to do in the first place, and fit the pin. We need the pin to be correctly fitted, and most importantly we need to make sure it's not going to start to fall out when the truck's running. If it's all spinning and it catches on something, the damage could be quite impressive. Some thread lock should do the trick. A little bit on the pin's threads will keep it in place. The diff case, just in front of the input shaft, has 2 holes in it, one on either side. One of the holes is plain and the other one has threads. We need the one with the threads on the top. Next we hold the diff case to stop it spinning and turn the axle shaft so the hole that goes through it lines up with the hole in the diff. Now we just pop the shaft in, being fairly gentle, rocking the shaft a bit if the pin won't drop in. I found the threads in the diff case weren't all that well cut, so the threads were very tight to go in. You could clean them up with a tap, but with a little bit of patience and a bit of brute force, the pin did thread in. And with the threads being so tight, it's even less likely it's going to fall out. Not too surprisingly, I've managed to get my fingers well coated in grease, and quite a bit of it has found its way all over the outside of the axle. For now, with a bit of kitchen towel for some grip, we'll just loosely install a couple of screws at the end of the axle, just enough to hold it together while I give my hands a good wash. Well, that's better, I'm not sticking to everything now, which is nice. We can install all the screws now, loosely at first, so we can double check everything lines up nicely. Now in theory, because all the bearings are a good fit, it should line itself up nicely by itself, but it never hurts to make sure. We could use some thread lock on all these screws, but I'm thinking if more of these bearings fail, we don't want to fight the thread lock if we don't have to. We'll just have to keep an eye on the screws just to make sure they don't start working loose. Refitting the axle should be fairly easy. We need to assume the horns again to hold the U-bolts up and hopefully keep all the bits together while the axle goes back in. We can lift the brace rod and position the U-bolts on the far side so we can slide the axle in. It's a bit of a fiddle and it would be very easy to let something slip. The handy bit though, once the axle's in, the brace kind of holds it in position. So once the first one's in, the second one is quite a bit easier. Next the plates go back on, along with a couple of nuts to hold it all together. Once it's stable, we can pop the rest of the nuts on and tighten them up so they're all even. Making them level with the end of the threads is a good place to start. Then we can tighten them all up a half turn at a time in the usual cross pattern until they're all evenly nipped up. Now you might have noticed some signs of slippage on the axle where it's spun in its mounts, so this time we'll do them up a little bit tighter. We're nearly there now. We need to slide the drive shaft's yoke over the input shaft and reinstall the screw pin. It wasn't tight when I took it off, so I'm going to use a little bit of thread lock this time, just in case. If we give one of the drive flanges a bit of a spin, we can see that the diff's nicely locked and it's turning the gearbox. Okay, wheels back on now. 3 screws, no nuts. We just need to make sure that they're nipped up nice and tight. Now not surprisingly, the steering isn't straight. I've got the front axle up on a box so the tyres aren't touching the floor and dragging. We know the steering servo is set up nice and straight, so we don't want to play with the trims. We need to adjust the linkage length. The easiest thing to get at is the ball end on the bell crank. We can pop it off with some pliers and adjust the length. The most surprising thing though, at this end of the steering linkage the thread is reversed. A bit strange, as usually with a turnbuckle you would spin the rod to adjust the length. This rod has a kink in it to clear the chassis though, so you can't really spin it. With the linkage length set so the steering looks visually nice and straight, we can set the endpoints to make sure that the servo isn't going to stress at full lock. You can see especially when turning left, it's actually pulling the axle against the chassis, which obviously isn't ideal. All we do is go into the endpoint menu, turn the steering wheel full lock and use the setting wheel to back off the steering until it's no longer straining. It doesn't take long to do, and it can make the servo last quite a bit longer. And the result of replacing the servo saver with a solid arm? If we have the front tyres on the ground, we can actually steer. Before the servo would go more or less end to end with all the motion being soaked up by the servo saver. There's still a fair amount of slop in the system, but it should be a lot more positive when we try and steer. The next step of course is going to be moving the servo to the front so the servo is more or less direct drive. Okay, one more little thing before we wrap up. One of the screws on the body has dropped out, so we need to replace it. It's just an M3 screw and a plain nut, but it's a major part of the body structure, so we can't just leave it. Right, so there we go. From the outside, there's absolutely nothing to show for today's work. It should be a lot nicer to drive though, and hopefully not get stuck as soon as the terrain gets a bit lumpy. And that's going to be it for this week then. It wasn't quite as I planned, but there we go. Sometimes you find things along the way. As always then, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you're not already, and leave a comment if you've got something to say. Bye guys!